Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for making it out here this early morning to join our distinguished lecture forum. Today, it is my great pleasure to introduce a very accomplished economist, Dr. S Sohn, who is currently a chaired professor of economics at the California State University. Well, he's going to give us a talk today on the recently very hot topic, namely the possibility of double dip, perhaps for the U.S. economy as well as for the world economy. As you know very well, the world economy has been recovering rather well for the past 1 year and a half, but lately it seems to be a little bit struggling, while the uncertainty is rising in many parts of the world, particularly in the southern Europe as well as in the States. So the world economy situation is pretty much in precarious situation at the moment, I think. So it is very opportune time to make a careful review on this topic of the possibility of a double dip. And I believe Dr. Sohn is the right person to address this issue. You probably have heard that Dr. Sohn, that a few years ago, the Wall Street Journal named him as the most accurate economist in the U.S. And beyond that, when I heard that, it wasn't too surprising to me because I knew that he worked for the Wells Fargo Bank, which is one of the leading banks in the States. Just I heard that the ranking is third. The first one is Bank of America, second one is Morgan Stanley, JP Morgan, third Wells Fargo. He worked with the Wells Fargo Bank more than quarter century as a vice president and a chief economist. I never heard any financial man worked so long period for one company as a chief economist. It's amazingly long time. And he also worked for the Hanmi Financial Corporation after he retired from this Wells Fargo and before joining this California State University. So I think he's very well qualified to make a review on this issue, and I'm very glad to have him here with us. Actually, you may remember, some of you may remember that he was here with us a year ago about this time of the year. He spoke on the similar topic as today's one. But as you see, there have been a lot of changes and a lot of new developments in the world economy. And I am very anxious, and I believe all of you will be very interested in learning whatever happened between now and then, to learn about some implications of those changes. And I think Dr. Sohn will fill some of the gap in there. Dr. Sohn earned his MBA from Harvard University and his PhD in economics from University of Pittsburgh. It is also somewhat unusual to have both degrees, and he's very good backgrounds to start with. Now, let me present Dr. Sohn to you, and please join me to give a warm welcome to him.
As Dr. Nam pointed out, when I was here a year ago, we were concerned about a double dip. Well, today that possibility has not gone away. But we may have to talk about something even worse, and something called a lost decade for America and Europe. And then clearly there are a lot of concerns about the dollar, the Chinese yuan, the currency wars and trade wars. Hopefully we can talk about some of these issues that I may not be able to cover all in my speech, but there should be some time to discuss these issues after my speech. Let me just begin with the U.S. economy right now. U.S. economy is basically not going anywhere fast. We have a jobless economic recovery. Economy is lethargic. But before I give you the bad news, let's talk about some good news, because there are some. There are sectors in the economy which are doing better, in part because of the economic stimulus program and the low interest rates. Exports have come back quite nicely, in part because Asia is doing very well. China, Korea are exporting to the U.S., but also America is exporting to Asia. So Asia is really the locomotive, the engine of global economic growth. And so U.S. is obviously benefiting from that, as you can see. Business fixed investment. Today, businesses, they do not want to hire people. They want to hire machines and computers and softwares. When you hire people, they eat and, they complain and then they sue you, and then so, it's very expensive. If you hire machines, they always show up. They're always ready. They don't complain. They don't eat. See? They don't get sick. And then so, well, one way to improve efficiency is to hire more technology in machines, and that's what's happening right now. On the other hand, if you look at the lines at the bottom, personal consumption expenditures, American consumers are no longer on a spending spree. They cannot afford it. And government expenditures. Well, this includes not only federal, but also state and local. I'll talk about that later in a minute, but while the federal government is spending a lot of money, the state and local governments are not. They cannot, because they've got deficits. They are laying people off. They are counterbalancing, offsetting what the federal government is doing. So that's the situation that we are in. But continuing with some good news before some concerns, real wages are actually holding up pretty well. If you look at the blue line on top, that's what's happening right now. If you look at the two other lines on the bottom, those were real wages in 1973 recession and then 1980 recession. So you might ask, why is our real wages going up so nicely, despite all the economic problems that we are hearing about in America? The answer to that is very simple: low inflation. Wages are really not going up all that rapidly, but inflation is low, in some cases going down. We are concerned about deflation. As a result, real wages are going up and then staying up there. So that, I suppose, is a good news. Some other good news. Corporations and businesses are beginning to spend some money. You look at airline traffic. It is not very strong, but it is no longer contracting. And in fact, it is beginning to grow. I go to Las Vegas from time to time to give speeches. And Las Vegas was very hard hit by the financial crisis and real estate crisis. Even in Las Vegas, I am told that conventions are coming back. More and more individuals are coming back to enjoy entertainment in Las Vegas. And so that is a good beginning. Cash-rich corporations. If you look at the debt-to-equity ratio, as you see here, you can see it is much lower than it has been. Today, corporations are loaded with cash. The important question is, what are they doing with the cash? Ideally, we want them to buy machines and hire people. That's not what they're doing. Again, as I said earlier, they do not want to hire people. They are very cautious. What are they doing? Well, they are parking money in treasury bills, treasury securities, safe investments. And also at the same time, they are trying to buy other companies. Buying other companies that is far cheaper and more efficient and probably more productive than trying to, well, build the plants and then hire people anew. So that's what's happening. There's a lot of cash. That is not the problem. The problem is intention. What do you do with cash? The other good news is, of course, the interest rate. A year ago, obviously, I did not realize and I did not foresee how low interest rates are going to go in America and around the world for that matter. And with so-called quantitative easing that I'm going to talk about in a minute, it can actually go lower. Today, the mortgage rates are very low in America. Cost of borrowing is very cheap. And this is one of the reasons why the value of the Korean won, the Brazilian real, the Canadian dollar, Australian dollar, they weren't going up. The reason is so-called arbitraging. Interest rates are so low in Japan, so low in America, zero. So you borrow money in America at zero interest rates or something slightly positive, and you take their money to Brazil, you take their money to Korea, Australia, Canada, and you can get higher rates, see? And besides, if Chairman Bernanke follows through with additional quantitative easing, the value of the dollar will go lower. And then you can have double benefits. By investing money in Korea, by investing money in Brazil, not only do you get higher rate, so-called spread, but also as the dollar depreciates, well, your investments overseas will be worth more. Well, that's pretty good, right? And that's what's happening today. And but interest rates are very, very, very low. The other good news about America is the fact that America is having no problem financing its current account deficits. Today, America needs to borrow about $2.5 billion per day, every day, 365 days a year. Now, you would think that that's a lot of money, and it is a lot of money. And America may have a problem financing that $2.5 billion every single day. Not so. Foreign investors from China, from Korea, from Europe, they are flocking to America, and they want to buy American debt. Every time we hear about concerns in Europe, South America, elsewhere, the first thing people do is they buy gold and they buy the dollar. And so the dollar has been much stronger than a lot of people thought it would be. If you look at this chart, you see there are three categories: stocks, bonds, and U.S. Treasuries. If you look at U.S. Treasury issues, you can see 47.7% of all the U.S. Treasury debt outstanding, that is held by foreigners. And U.S. corporate bonds, 20%. U.S. stocks, 12.4%. And you can see why I say America is having no problem financing its deficits. Well, that's all the good news I've got for the economy. Now let me turn to the bad news. Why are we concerned about maybe a double dip, a lost decade for America and Europe? And so let's talk about some of the reasons. Essentially, we are running out of ammunition. If you look at economic growth so far, it was heavily driven by two things: inventory building and economic stimulus program offered by President Obama. They both have had a very positive effect on economic growth, but we are running out of steam. Inventories are in reasonably good shape. Businesses don't have to restock inventories. They've got plenty of merchandise on the shelves. The problem is, not having enough buyers. There's plenty of inventories. How about economic stimulus program? We are gradually running out of the money. Now, later on, we can talk about whether we should do more, but at least that $787 billion is pretty much gone by the end of this year. So when you take those two things away, inventories and economic stimulus program, what's left? Not much. And you can see from my projections, as you go into 2011, percent change actually in 2011, not the level, but the percent change could actually be negative because we are not getting strength from these sources. How about consumer spending? Yesterday at another event, I was talking about consumer spending, how important consumer spending is in America, and that's what China should do, because the consumer spending in America is about 70% of the GDP. In Korea, it's about 65%. In Japan, about 65%. In China, about 35%. And then in America, as you can see, it is very important. But American consumers are very, very heavily indebted. They are in the process of deleveraging. They are raising the savings rate. However, you can see the debt level in relation to income is very, very high. Deleveraging process takes years, not months. We have just begun the process. And so don't expect this process to be over by the end of this year or even by the end of next year. As long as consumers are deleveraging, as long as consumers are increasing the savings rate, that means consumer spending is not and should not be robust. Of course, in the past, American consumers went on a spending spree based on borrowed money, cheap money. Well, now they are paying it back, and that will take some time. And this is a constraint because, again, it is 70% of the economy. Employment changes, you can see, from 2001 recession, 1958, and then the current recession. Well, normally, you could have like a V-shaped recovery, which was the case in 2001. In 1958, it was kind of like a saucer-shaped economic recovery. And if you look at the current economic recovery using employment, it is basically kind of going sideways. And that's why it is called a jobless economic recovery. Again, as I mentioned earlier, businesses, they are cautious. They do not want to hire people. They want to hire machines instead. And many of the jobs have gone overseas, went to China, went to South America, went to Canada. And also there's a mismatch. Many American males have been laid off from manufacturing, like Detroit, and also construction. Are those jobs coming back? No. Where are we seeing new jobs? We are seeing new jobs in healthcare, education. So can you take a construction worker and then make the person to work in healthcare, teach in universities? No. That's what's meant by job mismatch. And that is a long-term structural problem, and that's one of the reasons why you can see employment is not going up all that rapidly. Not only is the employment not going up very rapidly, but if you look at the jobless rate, it is stuck at about 9.5% to 10%. And there is not a good prospect that this will be coming down significantly anytime soon. And this is kind of like catching a bad cold and then not going anywhere. And this is a long-term phenomenon. If you look at so-called the long-term unemployed, you take all the people who are unemployed and you divide them into two categories, short-term and long-term. Anybody who's been unemployed for more than 26 weeks, that is 27 and over, they are considered to be long-term unemployed. You can see almost 50% of those who are unemployed today, they are long-term unemployed. And many of these are, as I mentioned, related to so-called structural unemployment. Jobs have gone overseas. There's a job mismatch. A construction worker, a Detroit auto worker, they can't work in healthcare, they can't work in education. And so, they're stuck, long-term unemployed, as you can see. Housing clearly is very, very important. When I was here last year, I pointed out the fact that in America, and then that's also true to a significant extent, I believe, in Korea, 1 out of every 8 jobs, one out of 8 jobs is related to housing. Not only construction, but the carpets, the glasses, the ceilings, and wallpapers, and etc. And then also finance, mortgage banking, commercial banking. Many jobs are related to housing. And that's why 1 out of 8 jobs in America depends on housing. And in housing, also there's a good news and some bad news. The good news is it has become very, very affordable. When it goes up, that means it's good, more affordable. When it goes down, that means it is not affordable. House is too expensive. You are using too much of your take-home pay to make monthly housing payments. And right now, as you can see, affordability index went up sky high. Affordability has not been this good for decades. Why? Well, you look at the payment on median price homes, it has gone down dramatically. I just refinanced my home in Los Angeles, and then my monthly payment went down by 25%. So I got extra cash. House prices, as you can see, has gone down, and then this is really a listed price. And today, if you have cash to buy homes, you can really drive a very good bargain. 10, 20, 30, 40%, especially for expensive homes, discounting 30, 40, 50% in some cases, that is not unusual because, well, there aren't too many buyers. And for so-called jumbo mortgages, you cannot get mortgages, therefore you have to use cash. Anyway, I'm saying that the affordability has gone up, improved, because number one, house prices have gone down. The other one is, again, the mortgage rates. And again, as I said, I just refinanced my mortgages, and it used to be about slightly over 5%, like 5.25%, and now latest my mortgage rate was 3.65. That's a pretty dramatic decline, right? See, and mortgage rates have really, really dropped, and then so that is good. And but the problem in housing is we do have a double dip in housing, not double dip in the economy, but double dip in housing. This is going nowhere. In fact, it is going to go lower in terms of the price, in terms of sales. One of the problems we face in housing in America and also in Europe is distressed sales, foreclosures, and then short sales. If you look at the chart on the left-hand side, that tells you the price of homes. Price of homes went down quite a bit, and then it has stabilized over the last couple of years or so. And this is related to distressed share of sales. You can see at one point, distressed share of sales was more like 45%. When distressed sales go up, house prices come down. When distressed sales stabilize, kind of move sideways, well, house prices move sideways. You can see a very kind of a good negative correlation between the two. Today, there are a lot of banks with properties that they want to sell, foreclosed homes, and then short sales. And that's one of the reasons why we are not going to see significant change in house prices in coming months and years, probably. If you look at the inventory of existing homes, there are a lot of homes for sale. In fact, in my neighborhood, there are about half a dozen homes for sale, and none is selling. Why? Because these homes are too expensive, and they can't get mortgages. There are people who want to sell their homes, but they don't even put it on the market because they know it's not going to sell, so why bother? So the potential supply of homes for sale, that is very, very high, and you can see that is going to drive prices down, not up, and that's why I say we have a double dip in housing. House prices are going to go lower, not higher, before we hit the bottom. Earlier, I pointed out that the federal government in America is trying to create jobs, deficit spending, and that is to a significant extent offset by layoffs by state and local governments. The federal government can print money through the Federal Reserve, right? All the states in the United States, the states must not and cannot have deficits. They must balance the budget by individual state constitutions. So when you don't have the revenue like today, they've got to cut back, and that's what they're doing. Not only the state governments, but also the local governments. California is really a good example. We've got huge budget deficits. They are laying people off. The city of Los Angeles, they've got huge budget deficits. They are laying people off, see? And they are not hiring people. Why? Because they don't have the money. They must balance the budget. You can see the state and local government budget gap. Negative, 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 and then, this is not going to go positive anytime soon. Historically, the state and local governments have added about 0.25% to economic growth. If GDP growth in the long run is, let's say, 3%, I'm saying that 0.25% of that came from activities of state and local governments. Well, today it's the opposite. State and local governments are subtracting from GDP, and so that's one of the weak spots in the U.S. economy. So what do we do? Do we have more fiscal stimulus? Another round of economic recovery program, spend another $787 billion? Well, you know as well as I do, we ain't got the money. Budget deficits are very high. And one could say, well, yeah, let's just spend more. Sooner or later, the debt-to-GDP ratio will come down. It always has in the past, so why wouldn't it? Well, this time it's different. You can see the mountain peak, Great Depression and World War II. And then after the Second World War, the debt-to-GDP ratio in America went down dramatically. Why? Not because we cut back spending, but simply economy grew that rapidly. So the debt-to-GDP ratio came down due to strong economic growth. Now look at the current situation. We had a credit crisis. The debt to GDP ratio, once again, is sky high. Will this ratio decline because the economy will grow very rapidly? Well, I mean, we're talking about double dip. We're talking about the possibility of a lost decade for America and Europe. Again, there's a little chance, probably no chance, that this debt to GDP ratio will come down because of stronger economic growth. That is not going to happen. So you can see that ratio will stay up there. The other one is the tax cut, the tax increase, actually. President Bush, he instituted the tax cuts. And those tax cuts are expiring at the end of this year. The question is, what will the U.S. Congress do? And that will have a very significant effect. Top income tax rate, right now it's at 35%. If Congress does not renew it, it will go up to 41%. And how about the dividend tax rate, the third line? Currently it's at 15%. And if Congress doesn't do anything, that will go up to almost 40%. So you can see what Congress does or does not do on the extension of the tax cut will have a very major impact. Now, in fact, my friends at Goldman Sachs, they are saying that if Congress does not extend this tax cut, we are going to have a double-dip recession. See? I hope they are wrong, but that's what they're saying. And we will have to see. It's pretty clear. If Congress does not renew the tax cuts, which means, of course, a tax increase, we will at a minimum have a weaker growth than you think today. And if Goldman Sachs is right, maybe we will have a double-dip recession. So, it is that important. What about Chairman Bernanke? He's talking about the quantitative easing, right? QE1 and QE2 right now. And when you talk about quantitative easing, well, Chairman Bernanke, of course, has a dilemma. If you look at the so-called model, it's called a Taylor's rule model. According to the Taylor's rule, all of you know what the Taylor's rule is, right? And according to Taylor's rule, it says the federal funds rate, which is at 0, should be negative, more like a minus 6%. Theoretically, that's possible. This means that, obviously the Federal Reserve is not going to lower the interest rates to minus 6. So it will keep it at 0, right? Okay, keep it at 0. Well, then, what can Chairman Bernanke do? He's running out of ammunition as well. So that's why he's talking about quantitative easing. Now, let me tell you, when Chairman Bernanke talks about quantitative easing, why he's doing that. First of all, he wants to lower the long-term interest rates by buying treasury bonds, but by buying mortgage-backed securities. Why? Well, short-term rates are at 0, so if you want to lower interest rates, the only thing you can do is what? Lower the long-term interest rate, right? So that's one of the things that he's trying to do. And number two, the value of the dollar. Well, China doesn't want to appreciate the value of the renminbi. And so Chairman Bernanke, he wants to create more money, flood the economy with the dollar. And when you print more dollars, it is not surprising at all that the value of the dollar is and will go down. When you create more of anything, the price of that thing goes down, right? And that's what's happening to the value of the dollar right now. And then there will be more and more dollars printed in the future. So, well, this is one of the ways of offsetting what China is doing. And then, of course, some people say this is actually going to help China. Why? Because the Chinese renminbi is tied to the U.S. dollar. Korean one is not. Brazilian real is not. And Taiwanese new dollar is not. Therefore, really the burden falls on those countries, Korea, Brazil, and etc., which are not tied to the U.S. dollar. And therein lies one of the dilemma. So, Chairman Bernanke will buy treasury bonds and will buy mortgage-backed securities, and value of the dollar will go down. But, in English there's a saying that you can lead a horse to water, but you cannot make that horse to drink that water, right? See? Okay? I mean, there's so much liquidity out there, we are floating in it. In Keynesian economic terms, it's called a liquidity trap. And so you add more liquidity, so what will that do? Maybe not much, see? And Chairman Bernanke is hoping that when he buys bonds and then lower the long-term interest rates, maybe that will do something, help out the economy, help out the mortgage market, but we will have to wait and see. And quantitative easing is necessary because, somebody has to be doing something, see? The jobless rate is very high. Inflation is, still positive, but not that high. And people are concerned about deflation. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. So why not try quantitative easing? You haven't got much to lose. And you've got to tell the people that U.S. government is doing something. Somebody's doing something in Washington, try to arrest the downturn in the economy. So that's what's happening today. And so if you look at economic growth, at best it will be lethargic. In the long run, the economic growth rate, the historical, so-called the potential economic growth rate is about 3% or 3.5% in that range. If we get something around 2.5% in the next year or two, we will be doing very well. And we might actually be falling below that. I actually think that the probability of a double dip right now has gone down. And why do I say that? Number one, I'm assuming that Congress will renew the tax cuts. Again, as I said, as Goldman Sachs says, if Congress does not, then we're talking about the possibility of a double dip. So the tax cut, whether it's renewed or not, that is very, very important. Number two, Chairman Bernanke, he's now embarked on quantitative easing number 2, right? QE2. And the third reason why the probability of a double dip has actually gone down is because, the economy is such a low base. See? You look at housing I talked about, right? It is already at a very low base. So how low can you go? See? And so it is not possible to go much lower because we are at very low, like housing, for example. Later on, I'm going to talk about a little bit the lost decade. Even though I'm not concerned about right now, I say the probability of a double dip has gone down. I am more concerned about the lost decade for America and Europe. I would rather have a double dip. Double dip means you go down and come back up, and then, you go back to normal, hopefully. When you talk about a lost decade for America and Europe, well, you're talking about, several, maybe 10 years. Look at Japan. They've been going through this lost decade for what? Now more than 10 years, right? And that is a much more serious economic situation. And if you have a lost decade, the probability of a deflation goes up. Deflation is like a quicksand. Again, we know what's been happening in Japan. They have not been able to get out of this deflation. And again, today I don't have time to talk about deflation in great detail, but as you know, well, deflation has many, many negative consequences. So what's going to happen? If you look at this chart, the kind of bulge that you see down below, that is the real economic activities, and then the line going straight up from left to right, that is the potential economic growth rate. As you can see, we've got a lot of excess capacity. I think it will take probably 3 to 4 years before we can eliminate that excess capacity. If we can eliminate that in 3 to 4 years, we would be doing pretty well, see? But it might take longer. So when we are concerned about a lost decade, when there's so much excess capacity, what people say about inflation, you and me and everybody, inflation expectation is going down. What's actually important here is not so much the actual inflation, but inflation expectation. That's far more important because that's what really drives what happens eventually. As you can see, inflation expectation is going down and down and down and down. So will it continue to fall and then move into a deflationary territory? Well, we don't know, but we will have to wait and see. But let me tell you what I think anyway. In America, at least, we will not have deflation. I hope not. And here are some of the reasons why. We still have inflation expectations. It is going down. It's low, but still positive. So people expect some inflation. So that's one of the reasons, and that's a good news. We want positive inflation expectations. Number two, wages. Even during the economic crisis that we've been going through, wages are not going down. This is what economists call wage rigidities. It only goes one way. It goes up, not down. And that's also true today. Number three, import prices, price of oil. That is going up, right? Price of corn, price of soybeans, and price of wheat, they're going up, see? And so commodities and import prices are going up, and so that adds to inflation. Monetary policy, we talked about quantitative easing, right? As Professor Milton Friedman said, Well, if you double the money supply, sooner or later, the price level will double. Well, this time around, may not work exactly like that. But point is that when you engage in quantitative easing, that hopefully will lead to more inflation, not less inflation. And as a matter of fact, Chairman Bernanke right now is talking about so-called inflation targeting, telling the world, telling the people, telling you and me that, well, we are targeting 1.5%, 2% inflation, see? Even though we are hopefully not going to have a deflation, hopefully we will not have a lot of inflation either. But there will be inflation sooner or later, and again, here are some of the reasons. I mentioned cost push. Cost of food is going up. Look what's happening in Korea. The price of vegetables, the pechu, is going up. See? And last night I went to a restaurant and then I said, let me have some kimchi, and they said, no, we don't have kimchi. Why? Because it's so expensive. We have a cost push inflation in Korea. China has a cost push inflation, and then also over time. Excess capacity. I talked about that excess capacity. It will take 3 to 4 years before we can eliminate that excess capacity, but it will. So as excess capacity diminishes, that will lead to hopefully more inflationary pressure. Taxes are going up, and of course fees. Everything from government fees to fees at the universities, they're going up. So when you add all this up, probably we will have low inflation, hopefully no deflation. Now let me talk about the global economy. And if you look at the global economy, the IMF says the world economic growth will be 4.3% in 2011. And you say, wow, that sounds like pretty good. Well, it is pretty good because historically the world economic growth has been between 4 to 4.5%. So 4.3%, actually that is not bad. But if you look underneath, you see problems. Almost all of that economic growth is coming from emerging market nations, such as China. They are going to grow 7.4%, and so-called the advanced nations, Europe, Japan, and America, will grow only 2.2%. So you can see tremendous dichotomy. We have a decoupling, see? And so that's the situation that we are in. Clearly, the center of economic gravity is changing from advanced economies, Europe and America, to Asia. And that includes, of course, China and Korea, etc. You can see on top the economic growth trend for Asia, it's going up. And Latin America, it's going up. But in the advanced economies, they are going down, trending down. How about inflation? I just talked about the possibility, at least the concerns about deflation in America, Europe, and Japan. Well, not so in emerging market nations. When you look at China, for example, well, there's inflation. And price of food is going up. The price of apartments are going up. Price of services are going up. So, well, we have a dichotomy. In advanced nations, we are concerned about deflation. In emerging market nations, well, we got inflation problems. But we are living in a globalized world. And to survive in this globalized world, we need rebalancing. Maybe not necessarily this year or next year, but in the medium term, meaning, let's say, 5 to 7 years. And we need global internal and external balancing. So let me talk about what I mean by internal rebalancing. Countries such as America needs to depress domestic demand in the medium term. Countries like China needs to boost domestic demand. As I mentioned, consumer spending in America is 70% of GDP. That's too high. In China, it is only 35%. That is too low. So, well, domestic demand needs to be reshuffled. Fiscal consolidation. In America, deficits are very high. In Europe, deficits are pretty high. And if you look at countries like Korea and Japan, and well, not Japan, but China, well, you got fiscal surpluses. They need to be reversed. And finance and credit. Today, many businesses, they cannot get credit. We need to stabilize the financial market so that financial markets go on doing what they are supposed to do, make loans. And when they make loans, hopefully, economy will do better. So we need a lot of internal rebalancing. But also we need external rebalancing, which is very simple. Deficit countries like the United States and the United Kingdom, we need to spend less and save more. In fact, well, hopefully they need to go into surplus territories. Surplus countries, China, Japan, Europe, even Korea, needs to spend more, boost domestic demand. And so this is what we mean by rebalancing. Now, we are making some progress on rebalancing. As you can see, the blue bars on top. Germany, Japan, oil exporting countries, China, emerging market, Asia. Well, the trade surpluses are going down, still positive, but going down. And then if you look at the bottom half, the red line, red bars, well, these are trade deficits or the current account deficits. As you can see, they are going down. So we are moving in the right direction, but still we are talking about a significant imbalance. And then so this needs to be corrected. Clearly, the global debt problem, whether it's Europe or America, this is going to be a limitation on global economic growth. The problem is that in advanced nations, as you can see, the debt is too high. We just went through the financial crisis. Have we solved the global debt problem? No, we have simply moved the debt problem from the private sector to the public sector. And the problem has not gone away, and that's why we have problems in Europe, in Ireland, Portugal, Spain, and of course Greece, and other Eastern European nations. Even in advanced nations, the United States, the United Kingdom, Japan, have a lot of public debt. So a problem has not been solved, it simply has been shuffled around. Studies have shown that the debt to GDP ratio, that is a very good predictor of future economic growth. Generally, for example, when the debt to GDP ratio is below 30%, economic growth during the post-war averaged about 3.5%. When that debt to GDP ratio goes up to 90%, then as you can see, economic growth is cut by half to 1.7%. When the debt to GDP ratio is hovering around 100%, then you don't grow much at all, which is the case for Japan, and which could be the case for the United States and the United Kingdom, and then of course I don't have to tell you about Greece and Portugal and Spain. And again, and then so. Let me just talk about China, because today China is really the only locomotive pulling the world economy forward and then upward. If you look at kind of that, it's not red, but kind of burgundy, I guess. If you look at the burgundy line, that tells you the private credit growth in China. During the financial crisis, they told banks to lend and lend and lend. Of course, Chinese banks, because they are government banks, they did what they were told. They made a lot of loans. And then the government decided that they made too many loans, so they're trying to contract, right? And then so you can see that the burgundy line, that's kind of coming down. And so if you look at the Chinese economic growth, this is Chinese industrial production, it's kind of trending down to sideways. So the question is, will they have a soft landing or will they have something worse? Well, China's economic growth is obviously very important because, again, this is the locomotive, the only locomotive that we have in the world. And in 2010, China's economic growth will be something in the range of 10 to 11%, which is good and which is important for the global economy. In 2011, well, hopefully it will be something over 8%. But some people say China may not experience a soft landing. They may have a hard landing. If China has a hard landing, then all the world will have problems. The question, I guess, that I'm raising in the beginning, will we have a double dip in America and elsewhere? My answer to that is probably not, and I gave you the reasons why. Again, unfortunately, one of the reasons why we cannot have a double dip is because, well, we are already near the bottom. We can't go much lower, see? So that's one of the reasons. And I'm again assuming the tax cuts will be extended, and then Chairman Bernanke will engage in the second round of quantitative easing, and that hopefully will do some good. So hopefully no double dip. But I would much rather have a double dip than a lost decade. Double dip simply means you go down, come back up, and then you move on. When you talk about a lost decade, this is a whole can of worms. First of all, when you're talking about many, many years, Japan, when you have a lost decade, the probability of a deflation goes up significantly. Again, look what's happening in Japan. It is a quicksand. Once you get into a quicksand, we know it is very, very hard to get out. And that's what I'm concerned about. So, when I was here last year, I talked about double-dip. You know, the idea of a lost decade was really not a serious consideration. And here I'm telling you today, I wish we had a double-dip instead, see? Okay? And then so this is the current situation. Well, let me stop here. And, you know, I have my website, drsohn.com. And, in fact, some of my speeches, many of my commentaries and my charts are on my website, drsohn.com. And there's no commercial, so you don't have to, I'm not trying to sell you anything. So hopefully you have a chance to come and then visit my website. And I try to update it every day. I did not really get into today about the currency situation, the trade wars, the currency wars, or anything else, the Chinese renminbi situation, and then so hopefully we will have a chance to have a dialogue, and then if you want to ask some questions about those issues, I am prepared to go to that as well. Thank you very much.
Based on very rich data sources, and he has come up pretty good pictures about the possibility of double-dip, and I think we are much relieved by his conclusion. Last time he said we're going to have 25% around chance to have a double-dip last year, but this year it sounds a little bit better because we're already in the bottom of the situation. So.
Last year I said about 25%, and then this year probably is down to 20%. But as I indicated, that doesn't mean that the outlook has improved. When you are concerned about the lost decade, that's a much serious situation that we are in.
Yeah. So I think it's really we appreciate that you are mentioning all these kind of details, using very clear data. So this statement is very clear and very straightforward. But we do have, I think, some questions within this, around his talks or beyond his talks. You may raise any questions if you have in mind. Please, you raise your hand if you have any questions.
뭐 한국말로 하셔도 좋습니다. 그러니까 이제
한국말로 하셔도 좋고. Well, let me open up the questions first. I think you didn't have enough time to cover, but the hot issue in Korea at the moment, not only in Korea but I think worldwide issue, it has become already the possibility of currency war, so-called currency war. What do you think you mean by the currency war? And if there is any currency war, what is the likely development among the major fighters here?
That is a very good and important question today. And first, let me talk about how we got into this current predicament. And there are three reasons for that. Number one is global economic growth, especially advanced nations. Everyone wants to grow by exporting. America is, China is. President Obama said that he wants to increase exports by 100% over some years, and then so everyone wants to grow by exporting, so that's one of the reasons. Domestic demand is not that strong. Well, it's a zero-sum game. Not everyone can export. Somebody got to be importing. See, so that's one of the reasons. Trying to grow out of this thing through exports, and to do that, you try to keep your currencies undervalued. China being a good example. The second reason is obviously the behavior of China. Today, China does not want to revalue their currencies. Estimates are that anywhere from 20 to 40% undervalued, and China has obviously domestic economic challenges, and they believe that exports is really the best way to create jobs in China, and so for domestic political reasons, they really do not want to revalue, allow their currency to appreciate. The problem is that the Chinese currency is tied to the dollar. when the dollar depreciates because of a quantitative easing of Chairman Bernanke, so does Chinese renminbi. But what about Korean won? What about Brazilian real? Well, they are floating. So really the burden falls on the countries such as Korea, whose currency is allowed to freely fluctuate in the currency markets. So the question is, well, what does Korea do? What does Thailand do? What does Brazil do? Well, countries such as Thailand and Brazil, they have already decided to take some actions. And, that's unfortunate. But so that really points to the possibility of the currency war. The third reason why we are in the current predicament is the capital flows. In the U.S. and in advanced nations, as I mentioned, the interest rates are so low. So, people are borrowing money in America and Japan and then go to Brazil, come to Korea. And when the money comes in this direction to take advantage of better returns, high interest rates, well, the Korean won appreciates. The Brazilian real appreciates. In fact, somebody said that today the Brazilian real is the most overvalued currency on this side of the moon. See, and that's probably right. And Brazil is really worried because so much money is coming back. And, some of the countries, they are now levying taxes when money comes into their countries. Like, for example, Thailand. They are saying that we are going to levy taxes on you. Why? Because, well, this is speculative and it does not represent the long-term value of the currency, like in case of Thai baht. But going back to the crux of the question, Dr. Nam mentioned, do we have a currency war or a trade war? Well, I'm not sure, we have a war, but certainly we are moving in that direction. And when things are slow and difficult around the world, again, countries are trying to engage in beggar, die, neighbor policy. And this is, by the way, what happened during the Great Depression. And to some extent, we should not be surprised that this is happening because when the world economy is lethargic, certainly amongst the advanced nations, well, what's happening is not unusual. But to me, the most important issue really is China. And, yesterday I had some debate with, the people from China. And the Chinese, they were complaining that America, you borrow so much, and now you are engaging in quantitative easing. And that is unfair because that means the value of the dollar will go down. And we have, $1.5 trillion in U.S. dollar assets, and the purchasing power of that $1.5 trillion of dollar assets that we hold will be going down. In fact, they called it about, so far they've lost about $500 billion in purchasing power. And so they were blaming America. My answer to that is, no one asked China to buy U.S. Treasury bonds. I mean, they're the ones who bought that, right? See? And so they made a business decision. So it turns out to be, in hindsight, maybe bad business decision. Well, that's their problem, not our problem, see? And, but the key, I think, is that China needs to play the game. It's kind of, suppose Dr. Nam and I are having a debate. And if I say that, I get to have the microphone, he cannot. I mean, that's not level playing field, and that's what China is doing, see? And then so they need to change the modus operandi. Unfortunately, I guess what I'm saying is that we are in the midst of, again, I don't want to call it a currency war, but we are moving in that direction. And I don't see how we can reverse this thing, especially when we talk about the lost decade, especially when you have China. I mean, do you expect China to turn around and, listen to what we are saying? I don't think they will, see? And yesterday, that gentleman from China, they called, America, he said American pressure on China that is immoral and unreasonable. Well, I think it's China which is immoral and unreasonable, not America.
연초까지만 하더라도 특히 동유럽을 중심으로 해서 금융위기의 가능성이 아주 크게 제기가 됐습니다. 그래서 최근까지도 아직 스페인이나 이런 곳에서는 여전히 문제가 되고 있는 것 같은데 유럽발 금융위기의 재발 가능성에 대해서는 우리 손 박사님께서는 어떻게 보시는지 그것이 첫 번째 질문입니다. 두 번째는 조금 전에도 손 박사님께서 말씀하셨지만 한반도의 이 국제적인 과도한 이동이 결국은 특히 그 이머징 컨트리, 우리나라처럼 좀 적은 스몰 사이즈의 이머징 컨트리의 경우에는 엄청난 문제를 일으키고 있습니다. 사실 2009년, 2008년 미국발 금융위기 가운데서도 한국 경제는 비교적 건실했거든요. 외환 보유고도 비교적 충분했고 그런 과정에서 한국 경제에도 엄청난 충격이 온 것은 결국은 이 한만이의 과도한 움직임 여기에 1차적인 원인이 있다고 보고 있습니다.
한반이요?
핫머니.
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 핫머니. 예.
그래서 지금 현재 뭐 G20 이 회의에서도 아마 핫마니의 과도한 움직임에 대한 일종의 규제 장치 이런 것들도 같이 논의가 되고 있다고 보고 있는데 여기에 대한 손 박사님의 견해는 어떠신지 좀 여쭙고 싶습니다. 이상입니다.
Eastern European financial crisis reoccurring again. I think there's a good possibility. Again, if you look at the European situation, European Union, and then of course plus on top of that, Eastern Europe, Hungary, and then Latvia, and Estonia, and etc. Again, there the problem has been, has not been solved. It's simply they kind of postponed the problem. European Central Bank, they are buying Greek bonds and Spanish bonds and Portuguese bonds, and they have a stabilized economy. And the Germans are writing checks, and they have stabilized for now. But have they solved the problem? They have not. And I think one of the fundamental problems in Europe is the euro itself. See, I mean, euro is very good for Germany, makes Germany super competitive. But it is very bad for Greece and Spain. Why? Because, the currency is too expensive. They cannot compete with Germans using the euro, see? And so what needs to happen, I think, is for Germany to leave the euro, see? And have their own Deutsche Mark back. They love their Deutsche Mark, and then Deutsche Mark would appreciate significantly. And then the Greeks and the Portuguese and the Spaniards would be able to compete with the Germans, for example. And, I say that really the Germans need to act more like the Greeks, and the Greeks need to act more like the Germans, and one of the ways of doing that is by having Germany leave the euro. My conclusion, I guess, here is that the problems have not been solved. It's been kind of papered over, and so it will come back. So that would be my conclusion. The second question about the emerging market nations. I mean, I don't call Korea emerging market anymore. I think Korea is an advanced nation. But anyway, so let's say it's emerging market nations. And one of the reasons why the financial crisis had not hit emerging market nations, whether it's China or even in Korea, is because the financial markets are not as developed. See, and then so in hindsight, that was a good thing. It didn't hit China because they don't have derivatives like we do in Europe and then London. We have some in Korea, but not as much as other countries. So that we didn't have too many financial cowboys in Korea and China, and that's why we didn't go through that. And in hindsight, that has afforded us some financial stability, and then I would have to say, probably that's a good. And on the other hand, in the long run, to have innovation, financial innovation, you need some of these financial cowboys, and then they invent new instruments and new ways of doing things, and that's how the world economy grows. How about this hot money? Again. Brazil is thinking about levying taxes on hot money. Thailand has decided to restrict inflow of hot money. And my concern is that it's really not a good idea for a country to restrict inflows or outflows of money. And again, I recognize that it does create short-run problems. But if you start restricting, where do you stop? See, do you become China? China, they want to totally control everything, see? And they want to have cake and eat it too. And so if you start restricting this, and then, tomorrow morning, what do you do? What do you do a week from now? So there'll be more and more in regulations. So that even though at times it can be painful, I guess my thought is that we should leave the financial markets alone. And the best way to guard against the flow of hot money is have a sound domestic economic policy, and let the world know that the economy of Korea, economy of China is strong. Therefore, even the hot money does come in and out, but that's really not going to rattle us. So
the time is, I think, about right to wrap up this morning session here. 8:30, and everybody has to go to work now.
Okay. My work is done.
Yes. So, again, I'd like to thank very much for your speech and your coming out in the morning. And we really enjoyed your talk and hope we can meet some other time.
Thank you.
Thank you.